The format of the summit is going to be a mixture of panels in which we actually kind of play out different ideas by bringing together mini versions of this larger collision. We're going to have some fireside chats, some personal stories, and perhaps what's the most important part, we're dividing all of you up into 19 different teams to roll up your sleeves, make some commitments, and forge those partnerships. The first idea we're going to explore is called finding common ground between different extremes. It's designed to be an executive summary of sorts of the larger issues that we're going to cover here at the summit. To introduce this idea and lead the discussion, I'm pleased to welcome Jill Hicks to the stage, along with panelists Susan Cruz, TJ Leiden, Majid Nawaz, and Noorhuda Ismail. Jill Hicks is a survivor of the July 7, 2005 London bombings, 4 coordinated terrorist suicide attacks targeting London commuters during the morning rush hour. Hicks was the last living person rescued with injuries so severe she was not initially expected to live. Though she survived, she lost both of her legs below the knee and a host of other permanent injuries, including hearing loss as a result of the attack. In 2006, Jill Hicks was appointed Ambassador for Peace Direct, which was voted the best new charity of 2005. In 2008, she founded Mad for Peace, a London-based not-for-profit focusing on projects that help build empathetic communities. Jill, over to you.
Thanks, Jared. And welcome to this morning. And I've had the great pleasure of becoming acquainted with this panel, and I'm hoping that we've formed some lifelong friendships already. But to start with, I think it's really important, rather than me do the introductions, is to pass over to you. And what I'd really like us to explore in your introduction is, firstly, who you are now. So we'll start with you, Majid, but who you were. And if we could look at those two parts of who you are today and who you were, that makes you be sitting or brings you to this panel this morning, that would be fantastic.
Okay, well, thank you, Jill. It's a pleasure being here, and thank you to Google Ideas and Council on Foreign Relations and Tribeca Film Productions Company for jointly hosting this event. I am currently Executive Director of Quilliam, which we like to bill as the world's first counter-extremism think tank. It's based in London. I'm also founder of a movement in Pakistan called Khudi, which is a grassroots movement, youth-led, that aims to challenge extremism on the ground in Pakistan and build a democratic culture through grassroots activism. Quilliam is a think tank, Khudi is a movement. Who I was, at 16 years old, I joined an extreme Islamist organization that aims to overthrow governments, whether dictatorships or democracies, via military coups, and establish in their place a totalitarian expansionist regime ruling by one single interpretation of Islam as defined by them. This movement I used to belong to has just hit the headlines 3 days ago because 5 army officers in Pakistan were arrested for being suspected of being members of this movement and plotting a military coup in Pakistan. And that's relevant because in the year 2000, we recruited army officers who had gone from Pakistan to study at Sandhurst, which is a military academy in London. And so the methodology of coming to power by this movement is through military coups and then establishing this state and then spreading their boundaries through a policy of war. And I left in 2007.
Thanks, Majid. TJ.
My name is TJ Leiden. I'm the founder of an organization called From Hate to Hope. I started it last year with my wife. It's a fairly new nonprofit in the United States. Who I was. For 15 years of my life, I was a neo-Nazi white supremacist. I was a skinhead. Started off at the bottom as a street soldier, worked my way up through the ranks, joined the United States military. Was very active in the U.S. military with my gang and my white supremacy. Did a lot of recruiting in the military, which still happens today in the U.S. military. Grew bonds, came back out. When I got back out, became a made member of the largest neo-Nazi organization in the U.S., Hammerskin Nation. Stayed into it and, until I left on April 26th of 1996.
And how old were you then?
When I entered in the movement, I was 14. When I left, I was about a week away from my 30th birthday.
Noah?
Okay, my name is Nur Huda Ismail. I'm the founder for the Institute for International Peace Building in Indonesia. This new NGO is a way for me to help former combatants to integrate the society by opening up a restaurant. So I transform former combatant from using AK-47 to fried, crispy and nice fried duck. So it's quite controversial approach because for me, you might disagree a lot of things, but when it's come to food, nice friend, life is good. So that's my work in Indonesia. Before I have a Kirpi background. When I was 12, I shared room with one of the Bali bombers. And my school met also suicide bombers. The founding of my school, also the founding of Jamaah Islamiyah, which is responsible a lot of bombers in Indonesia. So that's the reason why I'm come here. I just want to share my experience, and I want to learn from everyone here. And last night, for instance, I met one of the professors told me that there was a nice restaurant in Los Angeles run by gang members, and definitely after this conference, I will be there to learn. So that's how I am now.
Fantastic. And Susan?
My name is Susan Cruz. I currently work at an academic institution in the East Coast of the United States. I do a lot of work educating and advocating for youth who are systems involved in the United States, whether they're in the juvenile justice system or in the foster care system. Formerly who I was a member of a transnational gang.
So what's very interesting about this panel is how diverse it is, how you've all come from a very different place, and yet there is a label that unites everybody, which is a belief in a form of belief in violent extremism, and not only a belief, but an action to that. And I guess the greatest question that must be asked always of each of you, and indeed the greatest question that society asks when we see what happens around the world, indeed with terrorism, with any form of violent extremism, is the why. Because for many of us, it just doesn't make any sense. We can understand, I guess, concepts of gangs or belonging, or we've seen the intro film, and there's an understanding of that as a concept, but to take it further, to have a violent action to that, to promote or want death from that, to take another's life, is very difficult for many of us to understand. So the burning question that I must start with, of course, is the why. But equally, I would like to skew that slightly and ask, why not? Because that becomes a very different answer, I believe, and may fit to many of you. That is it a process that you drift into, that you become, well, this feels like an absolute rite of my life, of passage. So that becomes a why not? Or is there a clear why you decided to take the path that you did? And if we can open that up with you, Susan.
Well, as mentioned in the introductory film, I was first approached by a gang when I was 11 years old. I arrived in the United States displaced by the Civil War in El Salvador, which is where I was born. And not speaking English, not knowing the games that children play in the United States, really being an outsider, I found myself getting into trouble a lot, being made fun of what is now very popularly known as bullying. And I got to the point where I was fighting all the time, trying to defend myself, and I was doing this alone. And this girl who was in another gang, she says, hey, would you like to join our gang? We see that you fight really well. And
So from a very early age,
Yes.
the idea of an us and a them
Yes.
was starting to form in your world.
Exactly. And at the time, I didn't join that gang. As I went on to middle school, I actually started realizing that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't the only kid who was being bullied for the same reasons, because I didn't speak English well, because I was an immigrant, and I wasn't alone anymore. And I became a part of that, which has now grown into something totally different as to how we set out. And in terms of why not, I think it was mentioned, being alone means almost akin to being weak and being prey. And no one likes to feel that sense of powerlessness. No one wants to be a victim. So in the sum zero world, at least the way that I perceived it as the sum zero world, I realized that I'd rather be a perpetrator rather than a victim.
Interesting. So get them before they get you.
Well, it eventually becomes this proactive going after people before they get you, because you also had to maintain this, this aura, this reputation that you are not to be messed with. So instead of lying around waiting for bad things to come to you, you brought it out to them to make the point, to make an example.
Yeah. And is this something now, listening to Susan, that there is a feeling of identifying with that in your stories?
Oh, I identify with Susan completely, because for me, it gave me everything I lacked. It gave me an identity. It gave me a purpose. It gave me a direction to travel in life. I mean, before that, and every kid wants a sense of belonging.
And you're still very young though, aren't you, TJ, at this point?
I'm 45.
No, but...
Then I was very young, you know. Then
because, I mean, this is interesting with Susan. We're starting with 11
I think
years old.
all young kids at a certain sense, at a certain point in life, whether it's, I don't know, whether it's chess club, glee club, football, gangs.
Yeah.
They all want a sense of belonging. They all want to feel that they have a purpose in life. They all want to feel like they have an identity. This gave me my identity. This gave me my purpose in life. This gave me everything I was lacking. I think the why not was, in my case, parenting. My mom tried, but I was raised in a household where men rule and women are second class. So when my mom was trying to talk to me, I wouldn't listen. Because my dad would always say, you listen to me, not mom. And that was always, for me, a way of always putting mom off.
So do you think your mum could have changed your path had you listened to her?
My mom eventually did. When I left the racist movement, my mom was the first one I went to.
Interesting. So therefore, a complete turn in situation, even in that point.
Right.
Majid, do you feel any identification with?
Absolutely. I mean, this guy here, when I was in my teenage years, I'd be fighting pitched street battles with him, and he'd probably knock me to the floor if I tried now. But people like TJ were the ones who, his former life, were the ones who we defined ourselves against. And we were 13, 14-year-olds being chased by these armed neo-Nazi skinheads who were stabbing at us. And as you saw in the introductory video there, my white friends were stabbed. I grew up in a place called Essex. It's quite infamous, actually, in the UK, and for all the wrong reasons. And I didn't have any other friends apart from white English friends. And so these neo-Nazis, what they would do is they would hold me back and force me to watch as my white English friends were stabbed, merely for being my friends. And TJ and I have often spoken when we've been on these steering committee panels of the symbiotic relationship that our two former movements have with each other. They reinforce each other. So whereas we'd sit there and say all non-Muslims hate Muslims and want to annihilate Muslims, and we'd use these guys as evidence, they would say the opposite and use us as evidence. And we would actually...
Both citing each other.
Citing each other, and really funnily, there is cooperation between these movements on the two extremes. On the polar opposites, they actually cooperate with each other to reinforce each other's messages. There were ties historically between the Nazis in Germany and certain extremists in what was then British Mandate Palestine. And they were cooperating with each other across borders, even though they hated each other. And so that symbiotic relationship is one familiarity. The other thing that you've just said, which you said as well, Susan, is that, again, when I left my group in 2007, the first thing I did is I went to my mother, who had always been against me joining this organization. And I turned my phone off, I isolated myself, and I stayed at my mother's house for 3 months. And there are a few people in the audience who have met my mother, and they will testify to the amazing woman that she is.
How interesting. And Noor,
Yeah, I joined the organization when I was 17. My teacher at that school.
so 17.
Yeah, 17. The reason why I joined because I feel of being cool. Part of the organization called Darul Islam. The aim of the organization is to topple the Indonesian government, even though using violence. It's being part of big things. I was 17. I was nobody. Being proposed to join such a big movement, I was thrilled. And secondly, also my mother. Also, she was a very devout Muslim. She wanted to wear hijab back then, but my government back then, Suharto, said no, it's not impossible for you to do that. And my father also didn't have any chance to challenge the government, cannot allow to vote a party which is not supporting the Indonesian government. It's his civil servant. He got a lot of pressure from the government. Here, if the state put a lot of pressure also to certain Islamic organization or certain individual to express their religious freedoms, affect me when I was child. So I joined the movement. So the reason why I left that movement, when there was a split within the organization, I witnessed how hypocrite the leaders of the organizations. So the reason also why I established my NGO now, because my own roommate, when I was 12, I didn't feel comfortable studying that boarding school. 14 years old boy approached me and said, hey, it's good things to that Islamic boarding school. But 15 years later, the whole thing changed. I worked for the Washington Post, covering Bali. Police distributed a leaflet and I showed picture. Oh, Jesus, this guy, my goodness, is my roommate. Well, since that very day, I have very personal questions, why a normal individual, loving husband, caring individual can get involved in this political violent activity. A year later, my own schoolmate become associate bombers in Marriott Hotel. I was shocked. I'm like, oh my God, what's went wrong with that? So yeah, that's that I start this extremely small initiative in Indonesia, which some people call me, I'm losing battles because why are you doing this? So lock them in jail and then throw the key. That will be the best way.
I think this is the great frustration, isn't it? Because I know for me, the person who has created or caused my injuries is dead. So there is no sort of way that I can ask the why. And so therefore we have to, or we don't have to, but in an exploring nature, start to look at, is there a common why? Because if we can understand the why, does that help us to decipher a way out or to find the counter-narrative for the way out? And it's, when you're just describing now the person that you knew who was a Bali bomber, then we start to sort of almost do the identikit of that person. Was that person in the gang? Did he feel isolated? Did he feel he needed to belong to a greater cause? So I guess the sense of, for me, for the next question of all of you is, does the sense of having a cause, of having something to belong to, make it then feel very much when you're in that time and space that what you are doing is absolutely legitimate and absolutely right? And when you're right, it's very hard then to see that anything that you believe or do can have any movement for being wrong or any gap for being wrong. So I think I'd really like to try and explore that with us if we could, because if we're looking at the why, the sense of belonging, the sense of power, the sense of an us and a them, and if them are attacking us, then we better band together to get them first. This is all of a young age. Then as you start to grow and form greater opinions in society, greater knowledge of yourself, therefore does that then become the cause that you feel that you're fighting for? Who would like to pick up on that point first?
Well, I think for me, what it was I don't think there was a sense of, it was a complete sense of right. What I was doing was 100% correct. I was preserving my heritage, I was preserving my culture, I was preserving my identity, and I had to do that at all costs, even if it meant to the detriment of others.
But did you feel that your society was under attack?
Yeah, it was completely under attack. It was under attack by, multiculturalism. It was under attack by everything. It was under attack by, like immigrants. So we find people like Susan in the neighborhood who's like, you know, oh, they're coming here, they're taking our jobs. I mean, they weren't, but we always had this.
It's a fear.
It was a huge amount of fear.
Right.
So we always played these games, and for me, it, like I said, it gave me a whole sense of purpose, sense of understanding. It divided a line. Everything became black and white. You know, everything was very crystal clear, and it had to be done this way.
And if somebody tried to talk to you in that time that was offering the grey space, how would you react to that? So if there was a case put forward to say, look, these immigrants are good for the economy, they're good for society.
Back then,
Yeah.
I probably knocked them out.
Right.
I wouldn't have listened.
Right.
Because
So there's no dialogue, no opportunity for dialogue.
no,
Right.
there was no, because that shows weakness.
Okay. That comes back to the point earlier of
And it goes without saying, you know, all of these lifestyles, or whatever you want to call them, they're all based on a foundation that is self-destructive. And many of us don't realize it at the time. And so, because there is a sense of destruction, there is a sense of impending doom, the suicidal lifestyle, because gangbanging and all of these lifestyles, it's slow motion suicide. You go out there and you put yourself out there and you do what you do, you know, you identify yourself as something to the world, basically just waiting for something bad to happen. And you know this and you're prepared for this and you're okay with it. You make your peace with it, as crazy as that sounds. But I think it all goes back, you know, to where did it all begin?
Yes.
Where do you get this idea that it's okay to not make it to your 18th birthday,
Yes.
or your 21st, or to bury all of your friends,
Yes.
and just, you know, realize, when am I going to be buried? When am I going to die? And I think there was a study done by a social worker where she looked at death row inmates in Texas. And this was something that really stuck to me. And I read this article years ago, but it really just stuck to me because one of the things that she found, she was able, you know, to look back into years and years and years of all of these death row inmates who by now had already been put to death, as Texas is very quick to do. And she found that she was able to sort of group them into two separate groups. One group had had opportunities by which different people, agencies, teachers, social workers, whatever, had tried to get involved in the lives of these men. Somehow had tried to reach out. And the other group, they fell through the cracks, no one noticed, or no one cared. And interestingly enough, what stuck to me was that this group that had had some sort of interaction with somebody, they were the ones that expressed remorse, that felt, that, they apologized to their victims before being put to death, that they felt a sense of having refound their humanity, and acknowledged, the heinous crimes that they had done. This group had no remorse, would do it again at a drop of a hat, just didn't care. And it made me realize, where was it along the line that I lost my humanity? Where was it that I lost my sense of not realizing that someone that I was hurting was another human being? Because I was not seeing myself as a human being. And I think, this is where we start realizing, if we begin with that, if we take that on as a cause, how do we rehumanize someone that's been, stripped of, their sense of self, their sense of humanity, their sense of connectedness, to another human being, or the human beings that they're connected to are basically fostering this idea that, what, sooner or later we're going to die, who cares?
And I think this picks up a very interesting point of what unites us is greater than what divides us. But it's getting to that point, isn't it? Sorry, Majid.
Yeah, I was just going to say that on this note, I think it's really important that some people question what a summit like this can do to reach out to these people who are so close-minded and who think in a very black and white way. It's very important to reach out to those people and try and what we call de-radicalize those who are thinking in a black and white way. But the real impact that this type of summit can have is for those young kids, which is the majority of youth populations who are under the age of 24, which is a new demographic challenge coming up. There are a whole bunch of people out there, 1 in 5 in the world, under 18, or whatever the statistic is, who are deciding which way to go forward in a very difficult economic climate. And they haven't yet joined extremist organizations. They haven't yet become black and white. And the hope is that those people are watching, and they are open to the internet, they are open to Google, they are open to the social media. And the hope is that before they make the choice to go down the line to a point where they become like what TJ just said, that they'll even attack you for even questioning their values, The point is to stop them getting to that stage, and that's what we call the preventative measures. And so mentoring and reaching out with counter-narratives on the grassroots to present alternatives. I know when I was 13 and I saw the genocide happening in Bosnia, I saw these neo-Nazis attacking me in the streets, and I saw that I wasn't defined as, say, in terms of identity, as someone who belonged in the country that I was born in. It was a gradual process that led me to a stage where eventually I ended up in prison in Egypt for accused of trying to overthrow the Egyptian government at the age of 24. But something happened from 16 to 24 to get me to that stage. And if somebody had approached me at 15, perhaps, with alternatives, with counter-narratives, and with addressing all those challenges of identity and belonging and the narratives themselves, then it's not necessary that I would have gone down that line. So,
but I think we have a wonderful sort of, array of the why that comes through in the media, isn't it? And we start to portray angry young kids that are just angry young kids. And somebody comes along and it's like they've gone to a stall and said, hey, join my group. No, join my group. And we've got better benefits if you join my group. And is it as simple as that? Because this just seems like a very simple thing that we've got disaffected youth, that it seems to be very common for exactly as you've just said now, we're getting a wave of economic problems, and therefore you get a breakdown in even more of the structure of the family and struggles and parents out working twice as much as they did before. What happens to the kids? So if we start to get more disenfranchised, more disaffected, what are we doing as society? And is it just a question as simple as angry young kids looking for a cause? And we just have to hope that the right person comes along to offer a place to be, a family to belong to.
that is the case, but I also think there is something more to it, which is
so
that
simple.
it's currently not, it's trendy to rebel against society. It's trendy to join these organizations in, say, for example, when I talk in my context, which is Islamist extremism. It's not trendy in a country like Pakistan to go out there and speak about democracy at the moment, because people associate that term with all the loaded connotations of imperialism and colonialism. Secularism means anti-religion. These words don't even mean the right things there because they've been misinterpreted. So the challenge is to rebrand these terms and make it, as TJ mentioned in the introduction video, make it fashionable once more to be a democratic activist. The angry young kid in the 60s would have joined communism. The angry young Muslim in the 90s became an Islamist. What we want to do is what we see in the Arab uprisings, that the angry young 18-year-old today is overthrowing dictators for democratic values. And that's the rebranding that is already happening that we need to successfully achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. Noah, do you have
I fully agree with that. I fully agree with. We need to come up with the diplomacy to these people. We outreach where win-win solution. In the past, we remember what we call ping-pong diplomacy. Ping-pong is big things for the Chinese, but it's nothing for the US. But it turned out that ping-pong diplomacy can bridge the understanding. Yeah. So the same with my approach. We need to come up with a kind of social intervention. Yeah. And I choose restaurant business. I choose food because this is one of my former combatants coming with me now. In the past, he was like, to be a good Muslim, you have to know how to shoot, carry artifices, AK-47 to kill others. Now with the restaurant business, I can tell him, okay, no, you have a completely different world, you have a completely different purpose. But in the restaurant business, you cannot choose your customer. Anyone come, you have to serve. Just before come here, the guy got phone call from the police. Who I got phone call from the police? Pick up. And then maybe they're going to arrest me. And he went pick up. This is from the police. We ordered another 50 bucks. So I was like, okay. So here the guy, and he said to me, okay, in the past, yes, police arrested me. He fed me. No, I feed them back. Yeah. But they have to pay. Yeah. but here the diplomacy here, like, and this is what we call. I introduce them about life, which is completely diverse life. But I don't call it less tolerance. Who want to be tolerant here? Yeah. No one to be tolerant. Yeah. Like, this is mine. This is, but the fact to respect differences, the fact that we accept others, provide room for others to grow up and different, to respect. That is the key from restaurant business and food business, where you can actually interact.
So the greatest, if I can call it a gift, other than me having my life, which is the greatest gift I've been given back, was that the morning of July 7, after the bombing, I was labelled only as the little wristband that just said one unknown estimated female. And it was in reading that wristband that I realised the secret of life and how important we all are, how important humanity is, how interconnected and interdependent we all are on each other. For I realised that people had risked their lives to save mine. And all we had to go by before the London bombings was the Madrid bombing, of which there was a deliberate secondary device to target rescue workers. And what I found extraordinary in London was the example of people saying, I'm risking my life to go into a situation to save as many lives as I can. And I was this living example of a person, and it didn't matter. It didn't matter if I had a faith or no faith. It didn't matter whether my skin was black or white, because indeed my skin was black. It didn't indeed matter how much money I had. It didn't matter even if I was a nice person or not. It didn't matter. And I found that absolutely extraordinary, to be put into a situation where I could experience the very essence of what we are as people. And indeed I am here only because of their actions. And I like to think of it as I wasn't just saved that morning. I've been saved every day since by their actions. Because what I felt wasn't the medical intervention of the desperation to save my life. What I felt were people lovingly touching me, willing me, holding my hand, willing me to stay alive. And that has shaped everything I've done today. That has shaped me saying, I must leave my career in design. I must do all I can do, exactly as each of you, to make a difference, to make a positive difference, to use what has happened to make an impact for it not to happen again. Because this is really what we're all here to do, isn't it? To say, how do we end violent extremism? So of course, is there a moment for each of you? Or is it a process by which you've come to a realisation, can I call it that? Or a change in thought that has led you to think, everything I thought, everything I identified with myself before, I now no longer believe. So is it a moment or is it a process? Would you like to start that off?
For me, it was a process.
Right.
I had a series of epiphanies over a period of time. My sons were the first epiphany. Other things, talking with other people in the
Is that
racist
when they were
movement.
born, or?
Well, my youngest son was 11.
Okay.
My oldest son was 3. He used a racial slur to describe some people on TV. And I had to kind of think about where his life was going. I didn't want my sons growing up to be me.
Wow.
And so I had to figure out, if I didn't want my sons to grow up and be me, what was wrong with my premise of life? What was wrong with my purpose of life?
Yeah.
Had a series of epiphanies. Like I said, I went back to my mom's. And
what did Mum say, TJ? What was it that she said? Or was there no words? Was it a hug? What happened?
It was a hug, and then she asked me where her 2 grandkids were, and then the next day, what got me where I am today was she suggested that I go to this place called the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and it's a museum of tolerance. And I thought my mom was smoking crack. I mean, Mom, those are Jewish people. I'm an ex-Nazi. Not going to work. But it did, because of the simple fact is what you said. They reached out. They showed me compassion. For the first time, I had people that believed in me in a positive way.
So was the same sense of power and belonging that was starting to form? Like, are you starting to get the same feelings that you did when you were?
Yes and no. The feelings were different. We talked about this yesterday, where I had such control in the movement that I thought it was respect from the younger people. It was just plain fear. They were so afraid of me that they showed me respect, not because they liked me, but because they didn't want to get hurt. Now I had people that were respecting me and showing me true compassion that they didn't have to.
So it wasn't based on fear.
It wasn't based on anything other than the fact that they were trying to help me. And for me, I think that was, for me, it was the biggest growth. Maji talks about when he was in prison and how he talked with people, and that's how, helped him. I think each one of us has that moment where somebody just reached out at the right time and put us on the right path.
Right. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think the human beings are a combination, obviously, of the heart and the mind. And in prison, it was a process. There wasn't any one moment. But in prison, two things happened to me simultaneously. One was we were adopted as prisoners of conscience by Amnesty International, and they began campaigning for our release because we were always political prisoners. The organization I used to belong to wasn't a terrorist organization, though a military coup is inherently a violent act, and that's why I still describe it as a violent organization. And Amnesty campaigned for our release, and that opened up my heart. For the first time in my life, I'd seen people that were consistent in human rights principles, saying these guys didn't deserve the torture. These guys didn't deserve to be locked up in a country like Egypt for expressing ideas. I mean, we weren't involved in a conspiracy in Egypt. We were locked up just for being members. And then the second thing, so that first of all opened up my heart, but then the second thing was I was inside with people who began revising the ideology and began writing against their former views, and that's where the narratives began changing. So I began reading for the first time from people like the assassins of the former president of Egypt and others who were there in prison with me, what they used to believe in and why they don't believe in it anymore, and in arguing out why they don't believe in it and what was wrong with those ideas. And that began a process of unraveling mentally for me as well. And it's very interesting we're on this panel together, Jill, because I was in prison when the 7/7 bombings happened, when you were among the many others that were blown up in the tubes there. And I just want to, if I may, narrate one anecdote from prison, because there was a professional bomb maker that I was in prison with, and he was sentenced to 27 years. He was from a Central Asian country. He went to Pakistan and then to Afghanistan and learned how to make bombs. Then went to Egypt to go from Egypt across the Rafah crossing into Gaza to train the Palestinians how to blow up the Israelis. But he was caught in the Rafah crossing and he was thrown into prison and sentenced to 27 years. But this guy was a hardcore jihadist. And I remember having long discussions for many, many days with him. You know, I had 4 years in prison to have these discussions. So day in, day out. And I had many days where, when the 7/7 bombings happened, where he would be pro and he was for these attacks. And I was trying to convince him how that's not the best way. For us, it was a very pragmatic argument. That's not the best way to come to power. Surely you should, instead of trying to blow up everyone, recruit from the army and take over the state and then fight everyone with an army. You know, so we would argue it's more efficient this way. But the really interesting thing is that when the invasion of Iraq happened, he saw in the newspapers I would bring in from the British Embassy the over 1 million people that demonstrated against the invasion of Iraq in the UK, and the overwhelming majority of whom were non-Muslims, saying we don't want Britain to invade Iraq. I showed him these cuttings, and I said, are these the people that you want to bomb? And one day I was very surprised. I mean, he's a dangerous man. He was very trained. And he was like TJ, he's very built like this. And he came and he knocked on my cell door one day, and he had been thinking about it overnight. And he said, you know what? I've been thinking about what you said, and you're right. These people, this is the largest protest in the world against the invasion of Iraq, and it happened in Britain, a country that I used to say we should bomb. And it was that sense of justice that he finally saw, where people in Britain were saying, we don't care whether we're Muslims or non-Muslims, we're going to speak against injustice, that changed his mind and basically delegitimized attacks for him in Britain.
Interesting.
And that's just on your point, that these counter-narratives are so crucial to get out there. A sense of justice and a sense that people actually do care can change people.
A moment or a process?
I think it is a process. It's a gradual process. When I was joined the movement, Darul Islam, when I was 17, they thought, okay, you have to attack even the government using violence. But at the same time, I have to obtain the ID card belong to the government. I found difficulties. So I gradually, see the process here. The same when I started to work as a tourist guide, when I deal with the foreigners. you know, because with my pidgin English, you and me photo together in the corner, you know, like this small things like this. Back then I worked for an Islamic boarding school, so it's hard for me to deal with the foreigner. It turned out that an Australian tourist said, "Oh, Huda, it's time for you to pray." And I'm like, "Oh my God, this white Australian asked me to pray." And then when they hang out to have a beer, "Oh no, you cannot have a beer, right? You're Muslim." Like, okay, so like, it's someone else. The same with all my friend, all my dragon. I call my dragon out there because I'm inspired the movie called How to Train the Dragons, because I cannot kill them, but I train them, you know. So I'm a dragon trainer. When they arrive for the first time here because for the very first time for them to actually travel on proper document, first I have to make sure that they're going to use the real name. What is your name? My name is Mahmoudi, Ahmad, and then every single place he changed the name. Okay, stick with the name. So when I get the ID from my Indonesian government for the very first time for them, I get them to get a passport. And then we got a passport, I have to fight with the embassy also that this guy is okay. When they came here, to their surprise, oh my God, white people here are very nice. Why is everyone is clean?
So this is a process.
This is a process, gradual process.
Yeah.
That I think I'm very agree with you. You have to come up with counter narrative, but not only talking, but real experience, challenge, provide them with a completely.
There's something really big here amongst each of you that we have to get out in this session, and that is something that you said, Susan, to me, which was when you were in prison, you felt that it was an absolute insult to your intelligence. And I sat with that for days thinking, but we're all intelligent beings, aren't we, that have gone down a route, and there you are in prison thinking, actually, this is insulting to me. It's intelligence I want to touch on, and also courage. Now, that's not just the courage to leave, the courage to say, everything I defined myself by, I now renounce. That's one thing. The courage to go back and to educate and to stand up and to be very loud in saying that actually everything that I thought, everything that I defined myself by, isn't the way forward. And this is the path. And to take people with you on that new path, that takes an extreme amount of courage. And I'd love it if you can share some of that with us this morning. We have 10 minutes left, but it's a very, very important point. Susan, if we can.
I would just like to add that for me it was a process, and more importantly, I want to emphasize to everyone here today that it is not an aha moment, it is not a one-time epiphany, but rather, for some of us, it is a lifelong process. Make it, akin to an addiction. There will be times, that you will want to go back. There will be events, that will happen. In 2009, one of my very best friends, who was one of the ones that jumped me into the gang, and I consider more of a brother than my own flesh and blood brother, he was killed, and it just totally rocked my world. Because here he was now, he was older than I, he was in his 40s, and he was killed. And it was just something that I realized. It took me back, psychologically, emotionally, to a very dark place. Because you think that you've survived. You think that it's over. You think, that I'm in the clear now, and it's never like that. And you mentioned, when I was in prison, things that happened that which would have anybody else would have been scared straight. I don't want to do this anymore. It wasn't like that for me. If anything, it reinforced me more into the gang. I had a friend of mine who committed suicide in front of us. He shot himself in front of us. And I was the only one that was sober in that room to be able to try to keep him alive, and he died nonetheless. 3 months after that, I was shot myself. 10 days after I was shot, I was sent to prison, and now I'm sitting, shot, in prison, asking myself, this is the biggest insult to my intelligence, and yet here I am. And none of that changed things for me. It wasn't until I went back to my country that I started realizing we came together to protect ourselves, and here we are destroying each other. And there was no honor in that. There was just no sense in that. And I think for me, that marked the beginning of the change. I think, really what basically was for me the biggest push was going back and working with gang-involved youth. I remember that I hadn't set foot in a jail since I left prison, and I swore to myself that I wouldn't. But when I started, I was hired to work inside a juvenile correctional facility in Los Angeles County. And it was Challenger Memorial Youth Center up in Lancaster. And I remember the first day that I went in there, and I just felt this, I just was awash with emotions. And I felt like I was locked up again. And I thought to myself, what am I doing? I said I would never go back to prison, but this time I went back for a different purpose. And I just want to say, you know, the kids that I worked with, they saved my life.
So it's therefore it's
That
a
was,
mutual.
right, that
Yeah.
was, you know, why I keep on doing this,
Yes.
because reconnecting with them and being able, you know, to connect with them, it restored my humanity. And I want to say, I want to be bold and say that perhaps we helped each other.
Yep.
We helped each other, you know, find our humanity again. And I think that was something that kept me going and keeps me going.
Yep.
In spite of the fact that it is difficult, in spite of the fact that I've had kids question who I was before, and why I'm, you know, what am I doing? And really just, if anything, I love the challenge of trying, you know, to prove to them that I'm not who I was. That if anything, I'm trying, you know, to prevent, you know, them from
Them becoming.
following that same path of self-destruction.
Yeah. Would you echo that with
Oh.
your?
Oh, very much so. And you know, the one thing I've learned a lot from talking with everybody on the committee that from the times we've done, me and Susan and Maji at Google and Tribeca Films and stuff, is I keep finding that when I look at all of us, I think our biggest enemy was really our friends and ourselves. I really didn't fear being killed by Hispanics, blacks, you know, an Islamist. I wasn't. I was more afraid of the people inside my own group. And when I look at it, a lot of times that's who we killed more of our own than we did anybody else.
But
We
the
were our
courage
own
to
worst
go back,
enemy.
The courage to go back.
You know, I mean, and that's what I talk with a lot of these
Yeah.
kids. I mean, I go back and I speak with them, and I tell them, I'll guarantee you right now, you're more worried about the guy who you're hanging out with drinking tonight than you are with the kids across the street.
And do
You're
they-
more worried
do they
about
hear
him.
it? Do they hear you?
A lot of them do. I mean, I've been very fortunate. When I started this journey with the Simon Wiesenthal Center and the Museum of Tolerance, I hadn't gotten any kids out. Within a few months, I'd gotten 2 of my former friends. I made it a goal to get 91 kids out of the movement. I'm at 89 right now. I got 2 left. But then,
Why 91?
91?
Your figure, the target.
That's how I figured how many kids I got into the movement, by recruiting them and bringing them in. Those are guys I know I got in. And like I said, I'm 2 away. But I took what they call the Google challenge, and it means I got to get 10 times as many out. Which is like, I don't know why the heck I did that.
Is there, and I'm going to ask the hardest thing just to start wrapping up, is there a sentence, a word, an action that is effective enough to plant the seed of doubt that you use now in your lives? Majid.
See, that's a very difficult question because radicalization takes a few years to happen and a few years to unravel. So people often ask about epiphanies and what was the moment, and there was never the moment.
But
type.
a seed of doubt.
So a seed of doubt,
Yeah.
I mean, I think, I'm just going to echo what TJ said, because my first seed of doubt came many years before I left the organization. And that was, inside the organization, you begin realizing how much you don't actually like the people that you're with.
But it's your family.
Sorry?
But it's your family.
Well, no, they're not even, I mean, you're tied into them structurally, intellectually, and ideologically, but you don't like them, you fear them, and you don't enjoy hanging out with them. So the seed of doubt begins tactically, then it becomes strategic, then it becomes intellectual, and then it moves down to the ideology, and then you have what you're talking about, the courage to leave, which is very difficult because you're actually then breaking away from people who have become your social circle. But the seed of doubt does begin with what TJ just said, which is the realization that you actually hate this person more than the person you're meant to hate.
Interesting.
And that actually you'll find is common. If anyone's read George Orwell's Animal Farm, if you haven't, I recommend it. It's a wonderful book. I read it 3 times in prison. I'd read it when I was a kid, but then I read it again in prison. Because it's common, this schismatic nature of all ideologically indoctrinated movements. It's very common. They will eventually end up fighting each other, and factions emerge and they break up. If anyone's seen the film Life of Brian, you know, the People's Front for the Liberation of Judea and the Judean People's Front for the Liberation of, and they all basically, and they're all these different acronyms for the same cause because they're fighting each other. And this is a very important point. That's where I know, for my case and TJ's case, from what he said to me, that the seed of doubt begins just not liking the people you're with.
Interesting. Noor, would you?
Yeah, I think people to get away from this activity, it's required process. First cognitive opening, and then after that cognitive opening, we see a process of weighing, what I call pull and push factor. What are the benefits staying in the group? What are the benefits if I leave the groups? So I think social intervention, other people like us who used to be in that group, coming to do that, go back, and then try to provide alternative in their lives. So there is a process of disengagement here, disengage from the violence, even though some of them still stick with the violence. In my own case, I decided to go back to my own school, where I produced a number of bombers and also extremism, and to teach journalism, because if someone have a good journalism skill, it's hard for them to be radicals or to be extremes, because in journalism you have a cover both sides.
So
and
you would
critical
say,
thinking.
Be inquisitive.
Yeah,
ask
be positive,
questions.
ask questions,
Yeah.
keep asking questions.
Yeah.
Don't take for granted everyone come up to
What
you
you're
with a
just told.
certain topic,
Perfect.
you know. Because
Susan?
that is the problem. Most of the people live in the bubble, you know.
Yeah,
Thank you.
fantastic. Susan?
Well, keeping in mind that I visualize this as a self-destructive lifestyle, and especially working with adolescents, my tactic has always been, first and foremost, I don't tell them to leave their gang, because everybody tells them. And what do? They shut their ears and they just put up a barrier.
So that might be like the mother role then, saying leave the gang, so you don't do
Right,
that.
and there's also the authority, issue and whatnot. And they're already in a position where, as adolescents, everyone tells them what to do and they're wrong and this and that. And you want to give them some space, to feel independent and to have a sense of power and control over their choices. So basically, I try to keep it simple. I create cognitive dissonance by not telling them about life and their freedom, their life and their freedom. They generally almost always have someone that they love or care about, even if it's their homies. If you ask them, do you see yourself alive in 5 years? No, I don't. Are you kidding? I don't see myself alive in a year. Well, do you see your best friend alive in a year, 2 years, 3 years? What do you see for your best friend? And they all have someone, all of them. And if they don't, there's something else deeper. But generally, what has worked for me is, do you want your friend alive? Do you want to see your friend free? And for them, it's, yes, of course I want that.
So that's tapping into humanity.
Right, and it's also, putting them in a position, where they now have a sense of responsibility to care and to watch over their friend. And it becomes a mutual thing. And it also starts, for them, to question, well, if the purpose of, us being homies, why do we want, to live this self-destructive lifestyle? Why do we want to do this? And I try to, to keep it simple. For you, and your friends and the people that you care about to stay free and to stay alive, stay away from the violence, stay away from the criminal acts. The simpler you keep it. And it's an everyday thing. And it's an everyday thing.
Because I'd like to just wrap up this session by actually looking at myself as the complete demonstration of what we've been talking about, because I'm living the effects of violent extremism, but I am here without hatred, filled with love for humanity because of what unites us. So thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Majid, TJ, Noor, Susan. Thank you.